35 hidden truths about New York that will change everything you thought you knew 60 feet beneath the streets of Manhattan. There's a room that shouldn't exist. The City Hall subway station, sealed in 1945, abandoned, forgotten by most. But if you ride the number 6 train past its final stop, if you stay on board when everyone else leaves, you'll catch a glimpse of it through the window as the train curves back around. A ghost station, pristine tile work, vaulted ceilings decorated with skylights that once let in the sun, chandeliers that haven't been lit in 80 years. But here's what they don't tell you. The station isn't empty. MTA workers report hearing voices down there. Conversations in languages that haven't been spoken in New York for over a century. Footsteps on platforms where no one walks. And sometimes, late at night, when the trains stop running, the lights flicker on. Just for a moment. As if the station is remembering what it once was. This is New York, but not the New York you know. Not the skyline or the yellow cabs or the Broadway lights. This is the New York that exists in the margins, in the forgotten spaces, in the stories we stopped telling. What if I told you that everything you think you know about New York is a carefully constructed illusion? For the next 40 minutes, we're going to uncover 35 truths about New York that will fundamentally change how you see this place. Some will disturb you, some will inspire you, and some will make you question what else has been hidden in plain sight. This is a journey into the shadow state, the real New York, and it begins 300 feet underground, in complete darkness. The first truth you need to understand about New York is this: the city you see is only the top layer. Beneath Manhattan alone, there are over 600 miles of active subway tunnels. But that's just the beginning. Beneath those tunnels, there are older tunnels. And beneath those, there are spaces that don't appear on any map. In 1972, a group of urban explorers stumbled upon something impossible. Deep beneath the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, they found a railroad platform, full-sized, complete with tracks that connected to Grand Central Terminal. There's a secret train platform beneath the Waldorf Astoria, built specifically for President Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR was paralyzed from the waist down, a fact carefully hidden from the American public during his presidency. He couldn't be seen struggling with stairs or being carried. So when he visited New York, his private train car would arrive at this hidden platform. An elevator would lift him directly into the hotel. No cameras, no witnesses, no evidence. The platform is still there, the train car is still there, rusting in the dark, 60 feet below one of the most famous hotels in the world. But FDR's secret station is just the beginning of what lies beneath New York. In the 1960s, the federal government built something under Brooklyn that they never publicly acknowledged. There's a Cold War nuclear bunker beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, stocked with supplies for 1,500 people. It was discovered by accident in 2006 during a routine bridge inspection. Workers found a sealed room filled with 352,000 civil defense crackers, 17,500 cartons of medication, and water drums meant to sustain survivors of a nuclear attack. When the discovery was made public, officials downplayed it. But here's what they didn't explain. Why was this particular bunker sealed so thoroughly that it took 40 years to find? What else was stored there? And why were the locks on the inside of the door? Beneath the streets of Rochester, there's another world entirely. Rochester has a massive network of abandoned subway tunnels that were built but never used. In the 1920s, Rochester constructed an entire subway system, but the Great Depression hit. Funding dried up, the tunnels were sealed, locked, forgotten. Urban explorers have found miles of accessible tunnel beneath Rochester's downtown. Perfectly preserved stations with tilework still intact, and in the deepest sections, evidence that people have been living down there. Not just homeless people seeking shelter, organized communities, furniture arranged in alcoves, electrical lines jury-rigged from the surface. In 2003, a journalist exploring the tunnels found a fully furnished living room in a sealed chamber 300 feet from any entrance. The television was on. When he approached, he heard footsteps running deeper into the tunnel. He never found who they belonged to. But perhaps the most disturbing underground space in New York isn't a bunker or a tunnel. There are over 120 acres of abandoned hospital buildings on Roosevelt Island, and some of them were used for experiments that were never fully disclosed. Roosevelt Island sits in the East River, between Manhattan and Queens. Today, it's a residential neighborhood, but for over a century, it was a quarantine zone. The smallpox hospital, the lunatic asylum, the penitentiary, all built on this narrow island in the 1800s, all abandoned by the mid 1900s. In the 1950s, several of these abandoned buildings were used by the federal government for Cold War research. Exactly what kind of research remains classified, but documents released under the Freedom of Information Act confirm that biological experiments were conducted on the island. Specifically, tests involving aerosolized substances and their effects on human tissue. The buildings used for these experiments remain off limits to the public. Even today, certain sections are cordoned off. Former city maintenance workers have reported seeing unmarked vans entering these restricted areas late at night, removing materials, taking samples from buildings that have been abandoned for 70 years. Above ground, New York's secrets are just as haunting. Scattered across the state are entire towns that have been erased, not metaphorically, literally erased, removed from maps, demolished, submerged. New York destroyed at least 19 towns to build its reservoir system, and the ruins are still down there, underwater. In the early 1900s, New York City needed water. The population was exploding, so the city looked north to the Catskills and decided to flood entire valleys to create reservoirs. The town of Neversink, Peepacton, Cannonsville, communities that had existed for over 200 years. They were given eviction notices. Some residents refused to leave, they were forcibly removed. Then the dams were built, the valleys filled, and the towns disappeared beneath the water, but they're still down there, intact. When the reservoirs are low during droughts, you can see them. Foundations of homes, stone walls, the skeleton of a church. In 1965, during a severe drought, a diver exploring the Neversink Reservoir found the town cemetery. Headstones still standing. Some graves had been relocated before the flooding, others hadn't. Divers report something else. When you swim through these submerged towns, you can hear sounds. Creaking wood, the echo of footsteps on stone, as if the buildings remember what it was like to be occupied. And then there's Parksville, a perfectly preserved 1950s town in the Catskills that's been abandoned for 60 years. Drive along Route 17 in Sullivan County, and you'll pass through Parksville, or what's left of it. The buildings are still standing. The movie theater, the gas station, the general store. But there are no people, no cars, no lights in the windows. Parksville was a resort town during the golden age of the Borscht Belt. Then the interstate highway system was built. Cheap air travel made other destinations accessible. The Catskills fell out of fashion, and Parksville emptied out. By the 1980s, it was a ghost town. Step inside some of these buildings, and it's like walking into a time capsule. Calendars still hanging on walls, stopped at dates from 1962. Pharmacy shelves still stocked with bottles of medicine. A bowling alley with pins still set up in the lanes. Urban explorers have documented something strange. In several buildings, there are signs that people have been living there recently. Furnished rooms, clean, organized, with modern amenities, but no one ever sees anyone. Locals from nearby towns refuse to drive through Parksville after dark. They say if you stop your car on Main Street and turn off the engine, you can hear music. Big band music from the 1950s, coming from the shuttered hotel at the end of the street. The hotel with no electricity. But New York's abandoned places aren't all on land. There's an entire island in the middle of the Hudson River that was a secret Cold War military installation, and no one is allowed to visit it. Bannerman Island. It's located in the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City. A crumbling castle, vine-covered walls, towers slowly collapsing into the river. The castle was built by Francis Bannerman, who made his fortune selling military surplus. In the early 1900s, he bought the island and constructed this fortress to store weapons and ammunition. But in 1920, 200 tons of shells exploded. The blast was heard 25 miles away. It destroyed half the island. Bannerman died the following year and the island was abandoned. That's the official story. Here's what they don't tell you. During World War II and the Cold War, the US military quietly took over Bannerman Island. They used it for weapons testing, specifically testing chemical decontamination procedures. Documents declassified in 2001 confirm that several chemical agents were stored on the island in the 1950s. The island is technically a state park now, but access is heavily restricted. Large sections are off limits. Former park rangers have reported finding locked doors in the castle's lower levels, doors that lead to stairs going down, into the bedrock beneath the island. Stairs that weren't on Bannerman's original blueprints. New York isn't just hiding places, it's hiding events, phenomena that defy easy explanation. There's a spot in the Adirondacks where compasses don't work and no one knows why. The Adirondack Mountains cover over 6 million acres of upstate New York, vast wilderness, and somewhere in those mountains there's a place locals call the Dead Zone. Hikers who've been there describe the same experience. You're walking through the forest, navigating by compass, and suddenly the needle starts spinning. Not drifting, spinning. Rapidly, GPS devices malfunction, phones lose signal. The forest becomes unusually quiet. No birds, no insects, just wind. Geologists have found unusual magnetic readings in the bedrock, high concentrations of magnetite, but that doesn't fully explain the compass behavior. People who spend time in the dead zone report severe disorientation, losing track of time. One hiker went into the area for what he thought was 20 minutes. When he checked his watch, 4 hours had passed. He had no memory of where he'd been or what he'd done. Search and rescue teams avoid the dead zone. They won't go in after dark because they've had experienced outdoorsmen become so disoriented that they've walked in circles for hours. And when they're finally extracted, they all say the same thing. The forest felt like it was moving around me. In western New York, there's another phenomenon. Lake Ontario produces mysterious sounds that have been recorded for over a century, and no one knows what causes them. Sailors and residents along Lake Ontario's shoreline have been reporting strange sounds since the 1800s. Deep, resonant booms, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes isolated. They're loud enough to rattle windows, shake houses. The sounds are called the lake guns. Scientists have proposed dozens of explanations: earthquakes, gas releases from the lake bed. But none of these explanations fit all the data. The sounds occur year round, in all weather, and they've been getting more frequent. In 2011, a team of underwater acousticians from Cornell University placed hydrophones in Lake Ontario to study the sounds. They recorded over 80 distinct boom events in 3 months. When they analyzed the recordings, they found something unexpected. The sounds weren't coming from the surface or the lake bed. They were coming from the middle of the water column, hundreds of feet below the surface. The team published their findings in an obscure academic journal. The project was not renewed. When asked about it, the lead researcher would only say, "We don't have an explanation that we're comfortable releasing publicly." But perhaps New York's strangest phenomenon isn't in the wilderness or the water. There's a house in Nyack that a court legally ruled is haunted. In 1991, the New York Supreme Court made a historic ruling. They declared that a house at 1 Lavetta Place in Nyack was legally haunted. Not allegedly haunted. Haunted, as a matter of legal fact. The case was Stambovsky versus Ackley. Jeffrey Stambovsky bought the house without knowing its history. After he'd already committed to the purchase, he discovered that the seller had been telling people for years that the house was haunted. She'd even written about it in Reader's Digest. Stambovsky sued to void the sale. The court agreed, ruling that because the seller had so thoroughly established the house's reputation as haunted, it materially affected its value. After the court case, paranormal investigators gained access to the property. They documented over 40 separate incidents during a 2-week investigation. One investigator recorded video of a door slamming shut. The footage shows the door closing forcefully. But frame-by-frame analysis revealed no one was near the door when it moved. The house's current owners don't discuss what they've experienced, but neighbors report seeing lights in the windows late at night, moving from room to room, in a house where no one is home. Every state has dark chapters in its history, but New York's are particularly well buried. New York City once had a Negro plot panic that led to the execution of over 30 people, and it's been largely erased from history books. In 1741, New York was a colonial city. About 20% of the population were enslaved Africans. That spring, a series of fires broke out across Lower Manhattan. At least 13 fires in 2 weeks. The city panicked. Officials became convinced there was a conspiracy, enslaved people planning to burn the city and revolt. The trials were a farce. Confessions were extracted through torture. Witnesses were coerced. Evidence was fabricated. 31 black people were executed. 13 were burned at stake. 18 were hanged. Historical analysis has found no credible evidence that any conspiracy existed. The fires were likely accidental, but the panic had already done its work. An entire community terrorized, lives destroyed, and then the city moved on. The executions were barely mentioned in subsequent histories. By the time the revolution happened 30 years later, the 1741 plot had been all but forgotten. Today, there's no monument to the executed, no marker where the burnings took place. The event appears in few textbooks, erased like so much else. New York's relationship with eugenics is another buried history. New York State forcibly sterilized over 42,000 people between 1907 and 1964, and many of the victims never knew it happened. In the early 20th century, New York became a leader in the eugenics movement. The idea was to improve the population by preventing undesirable people from reproducing. People with disabilities, the mentally ill, the poor, criminals, immigrants from certain countries, people of color. New York passed forced sterilization laws in 1912. Over the next 5 decades, over 42,000 people were sterilized without meaningful consent. Many were told they were receiving routine medical procedures. Others were sterilized while institutionalized, with no say in the matter at all. The program was run out of state hospitals and institutions. The records were kept confidential. When the practice finally ended in the 1960s, there was no public accounting, no apology. The files were sealed. Many victims died never knowing why they couldn't have children. But New York's darkest secrets aren't all historical. Some are happening right now. Rikers Island is one of the largest jail complexes in the world, and what happens there is systematically hidden from public view. Rikers Island sits in the East River, between Queens and the Bronx. It houses roughly 6,000 inmates on any given day. Most haven't been convicted of anything. They are awaiting trial, unable to afford bail. The conditions at Rikers have been described by human rights organizations as torturous, extreme violence, medical neglect, solitary confinement used routinely, sometimes for months at a time. Journalists are not allowed free access to Rikers. Lawyers report that their visits are monitored. Medical examiners have found discrepancies between official reports of inmate deaths and physical evidence. In 2014, an 18-year-old named Khalif Browder was released from Rikers after spending 3 years there awaiting trial for allegedly stealing a backpack. He was never convicted. The charges were eventually dropped. During his time at Rikers, Browder spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. He was beaten by guards, beaten by other inmates. He attempted suicide multiple times. 2 years after his release, he succeeded. His case drew national attention. Reforms were promised. The city committed to closing Rikers entirely. But as of now, Rikers is still open, still operating under many of the same conditions. Inmates continue to die there. At least 16 deaths in the last 3 years. But the investigations are internal, conducted by the same department that runs the facility, and the results are rarely made public. But there's another truth about New York that connects to this. New York has over 50,000 people in its prison system, and hundreds of them are in permanent solitary confinement, some for decades. Solitary confinement in New York prisons means 23 hours a day in a cell roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. 1 hour of recreation in a slightly larger cage. No human contact except guards. The United Nations considers prolonged solitary confinement, anything over 15 consecutive days, to be torture. In New York, there are prisoners who have been in solitary for over 20 years. One man, held at 5 Points Correctional Facility, has been in isolated confinement since 1998. That's over a quarter century. He's developed severe mental illness. His original sentence? 10 years for robbery. He's been held beyond his original sentence in civil commitment. This isn't an isolated case. There are dozens like him. Held in facilities upstate, far from New York City, far from media attention, they exist in a legal gray zone. Not quite free, not quite sentenced, just disappeared into the New York prison system, where they can be forgotten. But New York's secrets aren't all about suffering and injustice. Some are about power. about who really controls the state. The Empire State Development Corporation has the power to override almost any local law, and most New Yorkers have never heard of it. The ESDC is a public benefit corporation created by the state. On paper, it exists to promote economic development. In practice, it has extraordinary powers. It can seize private property through eminent domain. It can override local zoning laws. It can exempt projects from environmental review. It can issue bonds and borrow money without voter approval. And it operates with minimal oversight. The ESDC has been used to push through some of New York's most controversial development projects. In each case, local communities opposed the projects. Local governments tried to stop them. But the ESDC overrode all objections because it has the legal authority to do so. The ESDC's board is appointed by the governor, not elected. The decisions are made behind closed doors. And once the ESDC declares a project to be in the public interest, there's almost no legal recourse to stop it. This is how a small group of appointed officials can reshape entire neighborhoods, relocate thousands of people, and transfer billions of dollars in public assets, all without a public vote. It's how power actually works in New York, hidden behind bureaucratic language and obscure legal structures. But there's another kind of power in New York, an older kind. One that predates the state itself. The six nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy have never ceded sovereignty, and they maintain their own passports, police force, and government on land within New York's borders. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, are a confederacy of six nations. Their confederacy is one of the oldest continuing democracies in the world, predating the United States by centuries. The Haudenosaunee never signed a treaty ceding their sovereignty to the United States. They maintain that they are a separate, sovereign nation, and they act accordingly. They issue their own passports. They maintain their own police forces on their territories. They have their own court systems, their own governments, and all of this exists within what New York State claims as its borders. The relationship is complicated. The state sometimes recognizes Haudenosaunee sovereignty, sometimes doesn't. It depends on the issue. There are ongoing disputes about land, about casinos, about taxation, about jurisdiction. The Haudenosaunee nations continue to assert their sovereignty. The state continues to claim authority. It's a reminder that New York, like all of America, is built on contested ground, on promises broken and treaties ignored, on histories that refuse to stay buried. Speaking of histories that refuse to stay buried, New York City's oldest cemetery is in Manhattan, and it holds the remains of over 15,000 people, most of them African Americans, both free and enslaved, who were buried and then forgotten for over 200 years. In 1991, construction workers in Lower Manhattan were preparing to build a federal office building. They started digging, and they found bones, hundreds of skeletons buried in neat rows, the African burial ground. From the 1600s through the late 1700s, this was where New York buried its African population. Enslaved people weren't allowed to be buried in church cemeteries, so they created their own burial ground outside the city limits at the time. Over 15,000 people were buried there. Then, as the city expanded, the burial ground was built over, forgotten, erased from maps. By the 20th century, no one remembered it existed, until those construction workers started digging in 91. The discovery was significant. The remains told stories that had been lost. Evidence of brutal treatment, broken bones, signs of hard labor, malnutrition, but also evidence of community, of care, of burial practices that mixed African traditions with Christian ritual. After years of protest and negotiation, the site was designated a national monument. Today, there's a memorial there. The remains of 419 individuals were reinterred in a ceremony in 2003. But here's what the memorial doesn't tell you. The burial ground extended much further than the excavated area. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that thousands more remains lie beneath the surrounding buildings, beneath the street, beneath the park, still there, still forgotten. Because stopping construction on the entire area would have been too expensive. So the city acknowledged the burial ground, built a memorial, and then built over the rest of it. Again. It's a very New York solution. Honor the past just enough to feel good about ignoring it. But not all of New York's hidden truths are tragic. Some are genuinely strange. There's a breeding population of wild parrots in Brooklyn, and no one is sure how they got there. Monk parakeets, bright green birds, native to South America. They've been living in Brooklyn since at least the late 1960s. The most popular origin story is that a crate of them broke open at JFK Airport. The birds escaped, and somehow, against all odds, they survived New York winters and established a breeding colony. But there's a problem with that story. Monk parakeets build elaborate communal nests out of sticks, huge constructions that can weigh hundreds of pounds. These nests take time to build. They require established colonies, coordinated behavior. If a few birds escaped at JFK, they would have scattered. They wouldn't have had the numbers or organization to build the nests necessary for survival in their first winter. Yet the parakeets were observed with established nests by the early 70s, which suggests they'd been there longer, or that more birds were released than the official story admits. Some researchers have suggested another possibility, that the parrots were deliberately released, that someone brought a breeding population into Brooklyn and set them free. Why would anyone do that? No one knows. But the parrots are still there, hundreds of them now, living in Brooklyn, building their massive communal nests on power lines and cell towers, thriving in one of the most urban environments on Earth, a population of tropical birds that shouldn't be able to survive New York winters, but they do. And then there are the animals that definitely shouldn't be in New York. There have been multiple credible sightings of mountain lions in the Adirondacks, despite the state insisting they were extirpated over a century ago. Mountain lions were hunted to extinction in New York by the late 1800s. The last confirmed killing of a mountain lion in the state was in 1894. Officially, there are no breeding populations of mountain lions in New York, but people keep seeing them. Not just people prone to misidentification, experienced hunters, wildlife biologists, park rangers, people who know the difference between a mountain lion and a bobcat or a large dog. Since 2000, there have been over 300 reported sightings in the Adirondacks alone. The New York Department of Environmental Conservation investigates each report, and each time they conclude no confirmed evidence. But in 2011, a mountain lion was struck and killed by a car in Connecticut. DNA analysis showed it was a wild cougar from the Black Hills of South Dakota. It had traveled over 1,500 miles. If one mountain lion can travel that far, why couldn't others? And if they're traveling through New York, why wouldn't some stay? Some wildlife biologists believe there is a small transient population of mountain lions in the Adirondacks. The state doesn't confirm this, perhaps because confirming it would require protective measures, habitat preservation, restrictions on development. So, officially, no mountain lions in New York. Unofficially, people keep seeing them, keep finding tracks, keep finding deer kills with the characteristic signs of cougar predation. What else is out there in New York's wild spaces that we don't acknowledge? Manhattan is slowly sinking, and it's not just because of climate change. Research published in 2023 by the US Geological Survey found that Manhattan is sinking at a rate of 1 to 2 millimeters per year. Part of this is natural subsidence. All those buildings, skyscrapers made of steel and concrete, weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, are compressing the ground beneath them. But there's another factor. Manhattan is built on bedrock, but between the surface and the bedrock, there are layers of softer material. And in some areas, the remains of old landfill. Large sections of Manhattan are built on fill. The original island was smaller. Over centuries, the shoreline was extended by dumping rock, dirt, construction debris, even garbage into the water. Some of the most expensive real estate in the world sits on land that was literally created by filling in the Hudson River. And that fill is compressing, settling. In some areas of lower Manhattan, buildings have sunk several inches since they were constructed. Engineers who work on these buildings know. They monitor the settling, they make adjustments, they reinforce foundations, and they don't talk about it publicly. Because admitting that Manhattan is sinking would create panic. So it's managed quietly, and the public is told everything is fine. But the engineers know. Manhattan is sinking, slowly, imperceptibly to most people, but sinking nonetheless. And with sea levels rising simultaneously, the city faces a compounding problem. The water is rising, the land is sinking, the gap is closing. Which brings us to another uncomfortable truth. New York City is fundamentally unprepared for climate change, and officials know it. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 gave New York a preview of what's coming. Storm surge flooded subway tunnels, knocked out power to millions, destroyed homes in coastal neighborhoods. After Sandy, there were promises, resilience plans, billions allocated for flood barriers, upgraded infrastructure, hardened utilities. Some of that work has been done, but not nearly enough. A study by the New York City Panel on Climate Change predicts that by 2050, sea levels could rise by up to 30 inches. Extreme flooding events will happen multiple times per decade, and the city isn't ready. City officials know this, the reports are public, but the political will to implement comprehensive changes isn't there, because the changes needed are expensive, disruptive. They would require hard choices about which neighborhoods to protect and which to let go. Managed retreat, the idea of abandoning certain coastal areas, is discussed in planning documents, but never publicly, because no politician wants to tell residents that their neighborhood will be sacrificed. So the plans remain partial, the preparations incomplete, and the city waits for the next hurricane, the next flood, hoping it won't be as bad as the models predict, but knowing it probably will be. But New York's secrets aren't all about hidden dangers, some are about beauty. Despite being the fourth most populous state, New York is over 60% forest and contains some of the most pristine wilderness in the eastern United States. When people think of New York, they think of cities, concrete, crowds, but by land area, most of New York is empty. The Adirondack Park alone is 6 million acres. That's larger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Glacier, and Olympic National Parks combined. And about half of the Adirondack Park is constitutionally protected wilderness, forever wild, no development allowed. There are forests in the Adirondacks that have never been logged, old growth trees hundreds of years old, lakes that can only be reached by days of hiking, mountains where you could spend a week without seeing another person. This is in New York, the same state as Manhattan, the same state where 8 million people are crammed into 300 square miles. But drive 3 hours north, and you're in wilderness that rivals anywhere in the country. It's a contradiction, but it's the reality of New York, urban and wild, crowded and empty, all at once. And that contradiction extends to the state's identity in ways most people don't consider. New York City dominates the culture and politics of the state so completely that upstate New York might as well be a different state entirely. The political divide between New York City and upstate is severe. They vote differently. They have different economies, different cultures, different priorities. There have been serious proposals going back decades to split New York into two states. It's never happened. But the sentiment remains. Drive through upstate New York and you'll see signs secede from NYC. There's genuine resentment, the feeling that New York City drains resources from the rest of the state. The reality is more complicated. Tax revenue from New York City does subsidize upstate, but upstate provides resources the city depends on. Water, food, electricity, space. It's symbiotic, but it doesn't feel that way to people living it. And that tension between urban and rural, between the city and everywhere else, is one of the defining characteristics of New York. A state perpetually at odds with itself. Which brings us to the final truth, the one that ties everything together. New York is not what you think it is. It never has been. We've spent 40 minutes uncovering secrets, hidden places, forgotten histories, strange phenomena. But the biggest secret about New York is this: the story we tell about New York, the mythology of the state, is a construction, a brand, a carefully curated image. New York is the Empire State, the city that never sleeps, the place where dreams come true. And there's truth in that mythology, but there's also everything we've discussed: the abandoned subway stations and secret bunkers, the submerged towns and ghost communities, the violent histories and ongoing injustices, the phenomena we can't explain, and the creatures we don't acknowledge. New York is all of it: the glamour and the rot, the ambition and the abandonment, the progress and the ghosts. It's a state built on layers, each generation building over what came before. Literally, in the case of Manhattan's landfill, and buried infrastructure, metaphorically, in how we remember and forget. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the truth of a place is always more complex than its mythology. Maybe the point isn't to replace the mythology with some real New York, but to understand that both exist simultaneously. The New York of tourist brochures and the New York of Roosevelt Island's abandoned hospitals. The New York of success stories and the New York of Rikers Island. They're both real. They're both New York, and understanding that, holding both realities in your mind at once, changes how you see not just this state, but maybe all places. Everywhere has secrets. Everywhere has buried histories. Everywhere is more complex than the story we tell about it. New York just makes it more obvious, because New York doesn't hide its contradictions well, can't hide them. They're too big, too stark. You can stand in Manhattan and see billion-dollar buildings next to crumbling infrastructure, luxury condos across the street from public housing, success and failure, past and future, all compressed into the same moment. And maybe that's New York's real gift, not the mythology, but the reminder that places are complicated, that truth is layered, that underneath every surface, there's something else. Always something else, waiting to be discovered or waiting to be buried again. The parakeets in Brooklyn don't fit our understanding of what should be there. The mountain lions in the Adirondacks challenge the official record, and all of it, all 35 truths we've explored, points to the same conclusion. New York is not what you think it is. It's more. Always more. And that's the secret worth keeping. Not because it's hidden, but because even when revealed, there's always another layer beneath, another story untold, another truth waiting in the dark, beneath the city, beneath the state, beneath the mythology. New York, the real one, the one that refuses to be just one thing, the one that contains everything, even the things that shouldn't exist, especially those